In the realm of fantasy literature, media, and even in the mythos of history, folklore, and fables, you will find a universe littered with brave and heroic warriors, mighty wizards harnessing the ley lines of the world, but unlike anything in the fantasy genre, nothing quite evokes wisdom, strength, and awe quite like a dragon. So many iconic and famous media depictions have shown us the likes of Tolkien's Smaug from The Hobbit, World of Warcraft's Deathwing in gaming, and Mushu in Disney's Mulan. The Hebrew Bible speaks of the Leviathan, the world snake Jormungandr for Norse mythology, and the Chinese speak of the Monkey King, who encounters various dragon kings. As a society, our culture, civilizations, and media is obsessed with dragons, and for good reason. Their lore and theme have spilled over into Yu-Gi-Oh! For so long and in so many ways, so much so that Yu-Gi-Oh! Created a second typing in their cards just to make more dragons. Today, I want you to gather round, get comfortable, and listen to the tale of one of Yu-Gi-Oh!'s most iconic, legendary decks of all time, the story of the Dragon Rulers. To fully understand the reign of the Dragon Rulers, it's important to map out what came before. What was the environment that they were released in? Something like a typewriter or the printing press might not seem that mind-blowing to us today in 2026, but in a world of quill pens and non-mass-produced industrialization, the printing press kind of seems almost magical. While a lot of decks before the Dragon Rulers were powerful in their own right, like the infamous Teledad deck, or maybe actually performing the wind-up or Gishki hand loop thereafter, Dragon Rulers were, by all accounts, the modern printing press of its time. Up until this point, one of the most powerful combos in the game was the wind-up hand loop, which, as the name implies, looped your opponent's hand, and while that might sound extremely scary, the reality is that it just wasn't that good or consistent. Requiring at least 3 cards to fully perform, before the time of ultra-generic extra deck cards or engines that bridge into other engines so seamlessly, at YCS Philadelphia in May 2012, the best decks were actually Dino Rabbit and Chaos Dragons, taking 12 and 6 top cut spots each respectively. Red Eye's Darkness Meadow Dragon could bring back Light Pulsar Dragon, and if you cleared both of these, then Pulsar would just float back into Red MD, who brings back the Light Pulsar. And of course, through many Gauge collabs, not to mention how frustrating a Lagia and 3 back row can be. The following year, 2 weeks before the release of the Dragon Rulers at YCS Meadowlands, this is what was to be known as Firewater format number 1, at least, as some of you may recall. The best decks were Mermel and Fire Fist. Mermel was able to do some kind of combos and end on a really powerful boss monster, Abyss Yugiohs, but very quickly depleted resources. Fire Fist had strong removal and consistency with Tenki, Bear, Gorilla, but the ceiling of the deck was, shall we say, humble. So we have a pop, a negate, and we have some consistency, but not quite grind game, really. Is this something the Dragon Rulers could fix? Lord of the Tachyon Galaxy was released on May 17, 2013, and with it brought 8 Dragon Rulers of 4 different attributes. 4 babies, 4 adults. The baby rulers could use their effect in hand to discard themselves alongside a dragon or a corresponding attribute to summon the adult counterpart from the deck. So Reactin could pitch itself out the hand with a blaster or a tidal or any earth monster in the game, even, I guess, Maxi, to summon Redox from the deck. Each adult Dragon Ruler had a total stat line of 4,600, some divided between its attack more than its defense. For example, Blaster, the Dragon Ruler of Infernos, was the largest at 2,800 attack. The Dragon Ruler of Boulders was the defender of the rulers at 3,000 defense and 1,600 attack. Fire across many cultures and themes representing aggression, strength, and power, and Earth for Redox representing guardianship of the land and protection. Even the stat lines themselves manifested themselves thematically in the Dragon Rulers. Each adult Dragon Ruler has 3 main effects: a hand or graveyard summoning effect, a hand effect when discarded with a corresponding attribute, and finally, the third effect, a searching of a relevant attribute dragon from the deck to the hand. The baby rulers initially on reading seemed quite lackluster. I mean, you go -1 to summon a big guy who can't even attack. But now you are starting to kind of see why card advantage didn't really matter. Because the discarded reactant is still fodder and fuel for the larger adult Dragon Ruler. Quite famously, people used to say that Dragon Rulers was the first ever deck to have two hands. One being the 6-card hand you begin the duel with, but also the graveyard. Entire secondary pile of resources. Each Dragon Ruler could also discard itself and a corresponding attribute to the graveyard to perform a special second effect. Blaster can be discarded with any fire monster to destroy a card on the field. Idol could Foolish Burial any monster from the deck to the grave, Raydox could Monster Reborn anything from the graveyard, and Tempest could recruit any dragon monster in the game from deck to the hand. And so you might be starting to notice something here. Dragon Rulers were not just simply limited to their own archetype. Mermel would go on to play Tidal for years to come. Volcanic would even utilize Blaster to synergize with Shell as discard fodder. And Earth Machine would play Raydox to facilitate plays with Machina Gearframe. This is why the Dragon Rulers were so powerful all together. They were versatile. They all replaced each other. They were big and difficult to out, yet so easy to put onto the board. They were explosive in their ability to OTK, and they overlaid into two of the best monsters for utility in the game at the time, Big Eye and Dracosac, with even the ability to make Synchro 8s with Stardust and Crimson Blader. Destroying a Dragon Ruler meant nothing unless you were going to OTK that turn, because they would just go to the graveyard and come back again. Banishing them wouldn't even help. They would simply replace themselves. We have to pause here and really emphasize this. This is almost a decade and a half ago. Floating effects, graveyard effects, card advantage, OTKs. This is fairly common in this day and age, but in the context of the release of the Dragon Rulers in Tachyon Galaxy, this was unprecedented. Lots of decks before this could do combos, could have grind game, could have resources and draw power, but Dragon Rulers put everything good together and created a deck and an archetype that virtually seemed to have no weakness. We had Recursion with Malicious, a card which was on the ban list for a long time, and Mizuki, another card on the Forbidden Limited list, but every Dragon Ruler is a Malicious and a Mizuki.
In addition, the deck had access to Sacred Sword of the Seven Stars and Gold Sarcophagus, allowing you to draw additional cards or search for attributes that you lacked access to. But the real kicker, the real thing that pushed this deck over the edge, was Super Rejuvenation, which is a quick play spell that allows you to draw cards in your end phase equal to the number of dragons collectively discarded and tributed during this turn. Not only would this often result in the player drawing 4 or 6 cards in the end phase, this card was not limited to hard once per turn clauses, and if drawn during the end phase, could be played again. So you could draw like 8, 10, 12 cards in the end phase, essentially letting you customize your ending hand, looking for powerful limited spell cards like Heavy Storm, Dark Hole, or hand traps like Max C and Effect Veiler.
They all have utility, would synergize with each other interchangeably between the attributes in different decks and themselves. Infernity could special summon a ton of monsters and then instantly run out of resources. The Dragon Rulers didn't do that. They never ran out of resources. This, without a doubt, would represent the biggest step up in Yu-Gi-Oh!
So Dragon Rulers really combined a grind game with explosiveness really well, and one of the first decks to really bring both of those things to the table. You know, decks back in the day either specialized at summoning big monsters fast or having a tremendous amount of follow-up, and Dragon Ruler, I feel like, combined both, because all of the big Dragon Rulers have the ability to like swarm the field with the baby rulers helping summoning them out from your deck, so you get quick access to all of the 4 Dragon Rulers. But if that initial push of like summoning a bunch of level 7s and making Dracosacs or Big Eyes wasn't enough to close out the game, all of the Dragon Rulers could basically jump back out from the graveyard by banishing other Dragon Rulers and then searching more follow-up on the next turn. Of course, from modern standpoints, this is nothing too special, but back in the day, this was something that was really unique to the Dragon Ruler deck. It was basically impossible for other decks to outgrind it, but it was also really hard to overwhelm because no other deck would be summoning big monsters as efficiently as Dragon Ruler would. which is an ability that a lot of decks have these days. You know, a lot of decks make strong boards, but also have strong follow-up these days. But back in the day, that really was something special that set Dragon Ruler apart from all the other decks in the format.
With the national and continental tournaments coming up soon after the release of the Dragon Rulers, it was no surprise that this was the deck to beat, and it was going to put up, no doubt, an unbelievable performance and respectable numbers for that competitive season. In Latin America, the Dragon Rulers took just under half of the entire top cut, 15 out of 32, and at the North American WCQ, they took 2/3 of the top cut spots. The continental tournaments were all won by the Dragon Rulers, all of them except Europe, where they still got the respectable second place finish. Central, South, and North America all were Dragon Ruler victories, as well as Oceania. For state or national championships in Europe, the Dragon Rulers were also crowned victorious in France, Italy, Spain, Poland, Mexico, and Croatia, failing only to get first place at the continental stage. The deck seemed like the deck to play, the best deck, the #1 strategy to run at the upcoming World Championship. It was a massive spectacle. These were the years that social media truly boomed for Yu-Gi-Oh! Specifically, and live streams became a thing, more prominent, more professional, YouTubing took off, and it all helped to truly create a special kind of mythos surrounding the Dragon Rulers in later years. At the World Championship, Dragon Rulers were once again dominant, the deck to beat, and of course, they were the victors. 19 rulers in the top cut, and Shin and Huang took down David Keener in probably one of the most infamous competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Plays of all time.
Yep. Huang is undeterred. He plays card destruction, discarding 5 dragons.
He is as cool as they come.
He does not want to lose this one.
No.
You get up 1-0 on a Spellbook deck, which doesn't happen often, you gotta win game 2. You do not want to give Spellbooks a chance to get back in it. Oh. And he drew into Blaster and Burner. And it looks like he's discarding them to destroy Jaugen, which will turn special summons back on.
The mirror match for Dragon Ruler was both sort of this slugfest and this practiced art that Dragon Ruler players had to master. Essentially, it boiled down to being able to clear the opposing board, usually consisting of 1 to 2 copies of Mecha Phantom Beast Dracosac and its tokens, playing through Max C and Effect Failure, and then dealing 8,000 damage in one turn after you've done the first 2 things. What made this tricky is that there were several soft rules you couldn't violate, or else you would lose the game on the spot. For example, if you had a monster with 2,500 or more attack points in attack mode and you activated Max C, your opponent could deck you out through a combination of Colossal Fighter and Forbidden Chalice, increasing that monster's points over 2,800 and ramming the Colossal Fighter over and over, forcing you to draw a card each time the Colossal Fighter was summoned. You had to take great care to conserve Effect Failure in the mirror match for Crimson Blader, a card that locked you out of summoning level 5 or higher monsters if it destroys a monster in battle. So even if you had drawn, 10 or 12 cards from a combination of Maxi or Super Rejuvenation, it largely didn't matter if you couldn't play any of them on your coming turn. You could not summon Big Eye in the mirror if you were planning on leaving it on the board, because it could be stolen by another Big Eye, and then that Big Eye would steal another card. If you left a monster with exactly 2,800 attack points in the board, Colossal Fighter could attack into it, destroy both monsters, summon itself, and attack again. So while there were a wide range of boards that would result in this required 8,000 damage, you had to take great care to avoid all these pitfalls and find the perfect timing and sequencing to OTK your opponents, and this sort of separated the good and the great Dragon Ruler players.
Which I suppose takes us to our next question. Why didn't they do better? Why weren't they a truly tier 0 deck like we'd seen in previous years with something like Teledad? What was holding them back and why? Well, it's a little deck called Spellbooks and perhaps an odd looking weird dragon called Ophion. Let's rewind the clock a little here and talk about the release of the Dragon Rulers. Up until this point, Spellbooks were basically just a mid-nothing sort of deck. They were pretty consistent, but they were very slow and had very little weight and offensive power. They could maybe maintain a bit of a grind game, But they also did have one of the best removal cards ever printed in Spellbook of Fate. But the thing is, as we went over earlier, is banishing one Dragon Ruler really that good? Every Yu-Gi-Oh archetype, realistically, as you all have heard many times, is just one card away, one link monster, one support card away from being a tier 0 dominant meta threat, at least in contention for being playable, right? Well, in the case of Spellbooks, it kinda was true. Spellbook of Judgment is beyond custom. It was an unbelievable tool for spellbooks, and remember the power level of this time period. It gave the deck so much raw card advantage, a way to completely halt the rulers from playing the game totally. It was a quick play spell that reads, during the end phase of the turn this was activated, you can add spellbook spells from your deck to your hand, except itself up to the number of spells activated after this resolution. Then you can special from your deck a spellcaster whose level is less than or equal to the number of cards added to your hand by this effect. Spellbooks were, if nothing, but consistent. They could get to their engine pieces often enough to be able to do whatever Spellbook players wanted to do, and with the addition of Judgment, you were basically never in a position where you wouldn't be able to play the game. 3 copies of Spellbook of Secrets, Spellbook Magician of Prophecy, Spellbook Crescent, Tower, Justice, Temperance. I mean, your deck was a literal library, both thematically and in terms of gameplay. The way this deck worked was that essentially you were activating a bunch of Spellbook cards in a turn to facilitate as many numerical Spellbook spells as possible. Secret searches the spellbooks, Eternity recycles the banished spellbooks, Master copies the spellbooks, Wisdom protects from spells and traps, and Power boosts your attack points. All you had to do in a turn was activate 3 spellbook cards after the resolution of Spellbook of Judgment. That way you would get 3 spellbook cards from your deck to your hand in the end phase, but most important of all, you would be able to special summon specifically a level 3 spellcaster from the deck, and that monster was Yugioh, the Spiritualist. Yugioh simply reads, your opponent cannot special summon. In an ideal world, spellbooks would have Tower up for the next turn, Fate and Wisdom search to protect Yugioh from being punched over with a normal summon, or interacted with Dark Hole and Trap cards. On the following turn, you would try and reapply that setup again, and maybe get a Star Hall down as well, which boosts your attack points, and start poking away with larger and larger Yugiohs or Kaikus, and maybe as well a Priestess of Prophecy. None of this lost to or suffered to 3 copies of main deck Maxi to combat the Dragon Rulers at the time, and it kinda really didn't care about Veiler because you had so many other ways to get to your spellbooks consistently outside of Spellbook Prophecy Magician. It probably says a lot that the only real way to beat the Dragon Rulers wasn't raw card advantage or skillful technical play and back and forth versus their multiple Draco Sacks and Fold Graveyard and resources. No, it was Resolve Judgment, Summon Yugioh, hope they don't draw Blast or Burner like Shen and Huang. The other notable enemy of the Dragon Rulers were the Evil Swarms, corrupted Gem Knights that put all their faith in the glorious leader of the flock, Evil Swarm Ophion. Ophion was a rank 4 monster that required 2 Evil Swarm monsters to summon, and it simply read that your opponent cannot special level 5 or higher monsters while this has material. Dragon Rulers would sometimes play like a Windblast or Raigeki Break, but the problem was that Evil Swarm had an in-engine searchable Forbidden Lance in the form of Infestation Pandemic, protecting Ophion from spells and traps while also maining 1 or 2 copies of Safe Zone to prevent Ophion from being targeted or destroyed by card effects. Because of this, Dragon Ruler players all pretty much had to side deck 3 copies of Xyz Encore, a quick play spell that detaches all materials from a monster, its activation of which cannot be responded to. Other decks like Consular kind of were on the periphery at the time because Pallades was a pretty good boss monster. It was able to bounce away 2 Draco Sacks over the course of 2 turns, it had multiple trap cards to stop further pushes, and ideally would draw Imperial Iron Wall. Not the most creative of strategies, but it was around. And it should be noted that Iron Wall was obviously very good against Spellbooks and Dragon Rolls together, and so pretty much every rogue deck in the game at the time opted to main deck this card.
Now, Yugioh's stats were very measly, 200 attack and 1300 defense, making him very easily to topple over by normal summoning Dragon Rulers like Stream or Reactance, so Spellbook players would play a wide variety of defensive traps, as well as cards like Spellbook of Wisdom and Spellbook of Fate to protect Yugioh from removal spells in battle, respectively. This strategy was very frustrating for ruler players to overcome, but not without holes. For example, the Dragon Ruler Blaster had an effect that allowed it, plus another fire monster, to be discarded to destroy a card on the field, which was not something that Spellbook players usually had a card that was allowed to interact with it. If the Spellbook player went second, they usually were tasked with removing 2 Draco sacks as well as tokens, which often required the use of multiple Spellbook Fate, which was a tool crucial to keep their Jowgen protected. Once the side deck was accessible, Ruler had access to cards like Horus the Black Flame Dragon, level 8, and Eradicator Epidemic Virus, which were automatic losses once resolved versus Spellbooks. Truly, the biggest hindrance that Spellbook posed Dragon Ruler was going first against them and being able to maintain their protection of Jowgen over a few turns, being able to amass enough damage to grind out a win against them. So, even though Spellbook's matchup into Ruler was considered favorable, it was by a razor-thin margin. In essence, it was a matchup of a death by 1,000 cuts from the Spellbook player or death by a single strike from the Ruler player.
In September 2013, Yugioh went through a pretty seismic change. This wasn't just related to the contents of the ban list itself, but actual structural differences were going to happen going forward. A lot of you are probably aware of the fact that until today, for whatever reason, the OCG gets cards earlier than us. The core sets, a lot of different side sets, exclusive cards sometimes. These are all things that the OCG just has differently to us. Now, the issue is that this was likewise the case in 2013, so no change there, but the ban list was the same for both regions. TCG and OCG were following the same Forbidden Limited list, and so going forward, this was no longer going to be the case. They would split this up. TCG would get its own ban list, and OCG would get its own ban list, which in hindsight obviously makes perfect sense, because why would you tune a metagame for a region that doesn't simply have those cards? It was very bizarre, but that was now going to change, and also the frequency of the ban list was going to change as well. Up until this point, it was pretty much set that March-September would be the 6-month cycle for the ban list. And now we were going to get them more frequently, every 3 to 4 months, which I suppose makes sense because, I mean, 6 months is half a season. So on top of this, not only were we getting more frequent ban lists, we were getting our own unique ban list in the TCG. Now, the fun facts and trivia aside, the one thing to take away from this is that this was a massacre. This was the biggest ban list in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! There were almost 15 unique changes to the ban list, with cards shifting up and down the list, and of those 15 were only just bans, like just straight up removing cards from the metagame. 15 total cards, and you're probably going to be quite observant. Yes, a lot of those were Dragon Ruler related. For the ruler hits directly, all of the baby rulers were banned. Every single one. Lightning, Reactant, Stream, and Burner. That's 12 total cards from the deck list, vanishing overnight. And with this many engine hits, you would think the Dragon Rulers were finally laid to rest, but, well, we'll get into that. For the other adjacent Dragon Ruler hits, Super Rejuvenation got banned, which was a bit odd considering that the discarding aspect of Rejuvenation kind of was mostly facilitated by the baby dragons. There was also card destruction that naturally got a lot of value in the Dragon Ruler deck, as we've talked about previously with their second hand being in the graveyard. Gold Sark was limited, so you weren't able to trigger all of the baby rolls directly from the deck for some advantage and consistency. But we also, of course, saw the one deck that could actually stand up to the Dragon Rulers, preventing them from being true tier 0. Spellbooks had Spellbook of Judgment banned. Jowgen, on the other hand, however, would live to see another day, and some of you probably recall quite recently when that happened finally. This ban list itself could probably be a little mini documentary alone, but in terms of other semi-relevant stuff, so many staples were also banned during this time. Monster Reborn, Pot of Avarice, Solemn Judgment, Heavy Storm. It was just a crazy period in Yu-Gi-Oh! I mean, it was... so much was going on. Even, like, rogue decks were getting all of these powerful staples hit. The Dragon Rolls were pulled back. So this was going to be a fresh new period for Yu-Gi-Oh! A new dawn and a new chapter, where the Dragon Rolls surely were gone. That's it. 12 cards to the main deck? It had to be the end, right? Despite taking such a massive hit in this ban list, somehow, someway, the Dragon Rolls would not only do well, they would dominate. 12 baby rulers, a third of the deck list was banned, and yet despite this, at YCS Toronto of the same month, the Dragon Rulers took 11 of the top 32 tops cut spots. That's a third of the metagame. They were still in contention, not only doing well, they were dominating, and somehow, some way, they got stronger. At YCS San Mateo in October 2013, Dragon Rulers won the entire event, and they took 23 of the 32 spots in Top Cut. That's over 70%. In the grand old homeland of England, in the UK, YCS London, this was, again, a dominant performance, with top 32 seeing 26 Dragon Rulers in the top 32 cut spot. All of these events were won by the Dragon Rulers. These are tier 0 numbers, over 70%. This is the territory of a one deck format. The Dragon Rulers in November 2013 would eventually finally be defeated by the power of Yugioh Karakuri. Blaster and friends sadly faltering to the power of the Karakuri deck, but Dragon Rulers themselves sadly only managing to take 21 of the top 32 cut spots. How does a deck get more powerful post banlist? Remember, these are tier 0 numbers. Of course, the Spellbook's losing judgment was massive in and of itself, but despite this, the Dragon Rulers card quality was still so good. You still had 3 copies of all of the adult rulers, but now you had to have some other engine in the deck replace the baby rulers. I mean, you couldn't just play staples. That wasn't really going to be enough. How did players adapt, and what was the engine that replaced the baby rulers in this deck? Well, enter the Dragunity rulers.
I mean, my first impression to the baby rulers getting banned, I feel like I remember thinking it didn't matter that much. Like, the Dragon Rulers were still all at 3 at that point. And they were at 3 for most of the next year, I think. I'm not exactly sure how I landed on Dragunity Rulers. But I do know that the Dragunity Rulers actually, I think, was only the second best deck of like the next format, because a little bit later, Billy and Robbie Boyajian added Trigon Dragon to the Dragon Ruler deck, and then you could dump it off Ravine and summon it back off Debris and then go into like Ancient Fairy. And I actually think that was a better route to take than the Dragunity Ruler deck. It was just, you know, the Dragunity Rulers were good in the beginning of the format, but then I think when Billy and Robbie kind of found that it was kind of the better path.
On January 1st, 2014, the new Forbidden Unlimited list dropped, and it was here that Konami brought down the Hammer of Justice once again on the Dragon Rulers. Every single ruler was limited. Blaster, Radox, Tempest, and Tidal limited to one single copy. We're talking about over 20 total hits for the Dragon Rulers here. All the babies were banned at this point. Card destruction, adjacent support things now, like for example Dragon Ravine, were banned on this list. We're talking tier limit level of damage done and casualties to the original deck list of the Dragon Rulers, where so many cards had been hit at this point. Where do you go from here? There's literally just 4 Dragon Ruler cards available that you can play in your deck at this point. What can you possibly do, and how do you build from this point on? You would think that this would be the end of the Dragon Rulers, right? The first YCS of 2014 was YCS Sydney, and in this we saw essentially a full return to the pre-2013 meta. A whole bunch of different decks were making top cut, like Harpies, Karakuri, Yugioh, and even Spellbook once again, but the real heavyweights of early 2014 would continue to be Fire Fist and Mermail, becoming known as the second Fire-Water format. And yet, despite this, a now ex-Konami employee, a player at the time, Robert Boyajian, managed to get the first ever top cut finish of the Dragon Rulers in 2014 at a YCS. Despite essentially being relegated to the position of pet deck, a tier 3 rogue strategy essentially, the fact that it managed to top a YCS still after all this time is legitimately incredible. Boyajian's deck was basically a Hieratic dragon deck. The Hieratics were a series of dragons which could do a bunch of things by tributing each other, and when they were tributed, they would be able to float into a vanilla, which helped facilitate a Hieratic Dragon of Atum play. This was a generic dragon rank 6 that could special summon any dragon from the deck. Boomer LP, as some of you may so generously put this. Hieratics offered explosive plays by being able to spit out a bunch of rank 6s in a single turn. You could go into a Tum, bring out Red MD, bring back another Heretic, tribute it, make another rank 6, like a Gauntlet Launcher, pop some cards, and then slap a Gaia Dragon on top of it for piercing damage. You could even end on something like a Photon Strike Bouncer to negate your opponent's monsters. The strength of the Dragon Rulers in this deck came from their ability to, of course, just be the big beaters, but it also offered some longevity and grind game when utilizing the trap card Heretic Seal of the Ashes. This was a trap card that could continuously just give you food for the Dragon Rulers. By returning banished dragons or sending them from deck to the graveyard, you would always have a Dragon Ruler special summon over the course of a whole turn. Now, while not a meta-dominating threat that it once was, it was still getting a couple of tops here and there. Sporadically splashed into different engines, it was still managing to make top cut of not just regionals, YCSs. The Dragons managed to take a singular top cut spot at YCS Berlin, another spot at YCS Mexico, and at YCS Las Vegas, it actually managed to take 5 total top cut spots, 2 of which were Mythic Ruler variants, which we'll talk about in a moment. But first, we have to go over the April 25th release of Soul Charge. This was a meta-defining card. It boosted all sorts of combo decks and control decks alike for the national season. Soul Charge was a generic spell card. It simply special summoned as many monsters from the graveyard as possible, giving up 1,000 for each, and at the cost, of course, by sacrificing your battle phase. And while a battle phase is of course an important resource, paying 5,000 life points for a whole new board to then do some synchro plays with or something, well, you know how the saying goes, the only life point that matters is the last one.
I remember when Soul Charge came out, my first thinking was I want to just build a deck that turbos into Soul Charge and makes it always live. And so Dragon Rulers were like really well fitted for that because you could, dump off Ravine, you could draw off like cards of consonance. And so your graveyard was always full and you were like digging through your deck to always be able to find the Soul Charge.
This then became a time period where Lightsworn, with their new structure deck mixed with Mythic Rulers, actually ended up becoming fairly popular. Light Raid the Dallas was a level 7 that you could summon for free, helping facilitate the rank 7 plays alongside the Dragon Rulers. You all know Card Trooper as a Time Wizard staple. It was a good normal summon that helped mill cards. But in that same set, we also got a new normal summon. This was Curry Bandit. Curry Bandit had the effect where it would excavate 5 cards, send all of them to the graveyard, and then add one of your excavated spells and traps. So what you're trying to do in an ideal world is mill 4 dragons and then add Soul Charge off of those mills with the Curry Bandit in the end phase. And while this was the end phase, being very slow by modern standards, this was 2014. You weren't really going to be at risk of dying, except in a rare mirror match, if your opponent opened really well, and the best hands in combo decks, usually facilitated by a Soul Charge, means that you're not going to lose, because there's no battle phase. Mythic Water and Tree Dragon were 2 monsters that helped make your rank 8 plays. They could be searched by banishing Tidal and Radox if you didn't hard draw them. Water Dragon was level 8, and so was Blue Eyes. And people realized that you could try and turbo through your deck with things like trade-ins. People tried playing cards of consonance again. You could search tutors off of your Dragon Rose, for example. You were basically just trying to dig through your deck to look for Soul Charge, filling the grave with dragons and bringing them all back for extra deck plays. It was a strong deck. It was relevant again. Soul Charge breathed a whole new life into the Dragon Rulers once more. This was the heyday of the ARG, Alter Reality Gaming streams and events, unofficial tournaments that ran across the east coast of the US, with popular figures at the time doing well with the deck specifically, like Alex Janeja and Patrick Hoban. In Europe, we saw Hand Rulers utilizing Fire and Ice Hand, getting a top 16 finish at the UK National Championship. The deck took top 4 at the Swedish and Danish National Championship, and at the Continental European Championship event, Dragon Rulers got so far as to take 2nd place. 2014 was a fantastic period for Yu-Gi-Oh! The golden age in my opinion, and that's a different video, but this was the time where social media was booming, people were reporting on their deck lists, circles were growing on Facebook groups, and people were just developing their strategies more. There were lots of different decks to play at the time that were good. Infernity, Geargia, Hand Artifact Trap Tricks, this mishmash of different archetypes and engines. It was all to play for at the World Championship this year. And at the World Championship of 2014, we saw a bunch of different decks being showcased. Yet despite all of their efforts, the Dragon Rulers were played, just missing out on Top Cut. Infernity was to be the deck of Soul Charge's choice that would take the entire event. Dragon Rulers missed out on a Top Cut spot at the World Championship. Thereafter, at the end of the season, we saw, for the new season, the release of Duelist Alliance, the set that changed Yugioh forever. Duelist Alliance was an incredible set. It had Shadow's Burning Abyss as the two major powerhouse archetypes for that format. Winda, as we've talked about in other videos, you'll know is a meta-defining, game-breaking card. Overnight, the meta changed. Decks that were popular before fell flat immediately in the fear of Winda, trembling before the power of not being able to special summon a lot. Now, while Dragon Rulers could maybe beat a Winda, they just didn't have the power level offered by Shadow's. And so, like the Dragon Rulers, most decks fell into obscurity for the rest of this season. And yet, on March 20th, 2015, things perhaps were not completely over for the Dragon Rulers, as Konami released a interesting side set called Return of the Bling. I don't know what was going on with the name either. This had a very interesting card printed in the middle of Necros format, the Ritual archetype that was non-targeting, banishing away the entire field with Trishula, locking down the extra deck with Unicorn. We got a new rank 8 monster called Galaxy Eyes Dark Matter Dragon. Now, this was very difficult to make originally with all of its weird convoluted materials, but you could slap this on top of another Galaxy monster. Essentially, all you really needed was 2 level 8s on the field to make Tachyon Dragon, and then rank up into Galaxy Eyes Dark Matter Dragon. And as we established previously, Dragon Rulers could be weirdly enough used as a rank 8 toolbox deck. By using all of the draw cards associated with them, you could find a way to make a rank 8 play. So, on summon, you would activate the effect of Galaxy Eyes Dark Matter to banish 3 cards out of your opponent's deck, which at the time was not really a bad thing. It's not like your opponent was going to banish Dormouse, March Hare, and White Rabbit, right? The issue with Dark Matter Dragon is that in order to pull this effect off, it had a cost associated with it. And the cost associated with Galaxy Eyes Dark Matter Dragon is that on summon, for cost, you could mill 3 dragons from your deck to the graveyard. For cost, can I just emphasize, for cost, mill 3 dragons. People were sending Eclipse Wyvern and 2 Dragon Rulers to immediately trigger, get out a Red Eyes Darkness Meadow Dragon. It was kinda crazy. Some people played Beast King Barbaros just as a level 8 normal summon. You could pair it with the Water Dragon to make an instant Xyz play. People were also playing Legendary Maju Garzette, a level 8 monster that was fairly easy to summon as well. People scrambled to find all kinds of instant rank 8 plays to take advantage of Galaxy Eyes Dark Matter Dragon. This deck immediately began topping. On release weekend, there were multiple regionals where Dragon Rulers were topping again, in the middle of Necros format. And yet, it seemed to kind of vanish. For those of you who've ever looked into historical Yu-Gi-Oh! And researched Necros format over 10 years ago, you'd think you would have heard of Dragon Rulers during this time period, but it was really all about Clifford, Shadow, and Necros, as well as Burning Abyss. 11 days later, the ban list came. And while this gave some generous balancing of Necros at the time, Konami immediately banned every Dragon Ruler. Every single Dragon Ruler, all of them, gone in the middle of Necros format. Galaxy Eyes Dark Matter was about to change the metagame in some type of crazy way. It's hard to say in hindsight how good this would have been. Immediate tops on release weekend is very impressive for any deck. But at the end of the day, these were regionals, local events, small-scale tournaments. It was only 10 days before they banned it. We never had a major event, a YCS, a premier event, a national championship. It's hard to say in hindsight. Would Dark Matter Dragon Rulers have been a meta-contending threat for the national season, for the continental events? It's hard to say. Perhaps we need to check out Lithium's cross-ban list tournament to see how that would go. This was the end of an era. The Dragon Rulers were gone. They were banned. There was no way to even try and play these as a pet deck. You look at something like Tier Limit, where every name is limited and it's super inconsistent, but there's like still kind of ways to do. You can't do that with the Dragon Rulers. They're all banned at this point. This was the nail in the coffin, and the ban list got rid of them forever. In July 2019, the Dragon Rulers would slowly be unbanned, and eventually over time they would become fully unrestricted, but never really seeing any true play. By the time they could actually be fully played, they had just aged too much. On May 1st, 2025, Alliance Insight would see new Dragon Ruler support release. The cards themselves were genuinely incredible. An Exeme also that copies the discard effect of all of the rulers, which is usually the best effect, a pop, a reborn, all kinds of generating advantage through their effects, but it really wasn't enough to bring them into meta contention. Rulers would ultimately become what they were fighting in their prime days, a deck that kind of focused on summoning a Floodgate, and this time it was a barrier statue. We've seen some relevance of Dragon Rulers in Genesis format being a decent deck, but never really climbing to the upper echelons in the same way that Radiant Typhoon, Onomat, or Cool Toon has been doing in the most recent formats. Dragon Rulers bring up a really interesting discussion about power creep and power spikes. How far does a new deck have to go in order to either sell product or beat what came before it? The Dragon Rulers are truly legendary in so many different ways. They represent one of the coolest themes ever introduced in Yu-Gi-Oh! The splashability of the dragons were something to consider at the time. Whatever you want to say or think about the Dragon Rulers either historically or until now, what can absolutely be seen is that this is a deck of legend, one of the greatest of all time. In its absolute peak, weirdly enough, after the banning of the baby rulers, it was a tier 0 deck. It was completely unbeatable. People tried this deck out in different forms and gave it different tech cards, and we even saw the resurgence of the deck with new big additions to the game like Soul Charge. But ultimately in this day and age, again, as incredible as the new cards are, they just can't stand the test of time. Thank you so much for watching this month's historical documentary. So many of you enjoyed last month's, which was the Firewall history, and I'm glad that we could finally bring to you the Dragon Roll one today. I will give you a heartfelt thank you, but also to implore you to become a patron member. These videos require so much time, effort, research, editing. A lot of love and care goes into these documentaries, and it would mean a lot to me if you could consider becoming either a YouTube channel member or Patreon member to help support this type of video going forward. Aiming for at least one of these big, massive historical documentaries once a month, so stay tuned for next month, where we will be exploring the history, legacy, rise, and fall of Pendulum.
We had a tournament in Dublin recently. I think it was Sunday. Yeah, that was like 3 days ago. I went 3-2 at the end of the day, which wasn't too bad. I was against Gear Games Spellbook, so